She woke up before dawn, the cold biting at her fingers as she walked to the airfield. Her father had taught her long ago that engines have hearts, that you can feel their pulse if you just pay attention. She bent over the Messerschmitt, her hands oily, eyes scanning every gauge, every line of the metal. The plane had returned from combat, its engine trembling, almost like it was gasping. Most would call it luck, but she listened closely, felt the uneven rhythm. That night, everyone gone, she stayed crouched beside it, fingers tracing heat patterns, listening. The engine was starving unevenly, not for fuel, but for air. Engineers had never tested for this. She adjusted tiny baffles, just a fingertip movement, invisible to inspectors. Days later, the same plane returned from a dogfight, screaming and overheating, yet it held together. The pilot said it stabilized mid-climb, something impossible by the book. She smiled softly, knowing why. She had created a pocket inside the engine, one that only activated when everything else was failing. It wasn't in any manual. Not in any blueprint. Born from listening, from intuition. Months passed, planes she touched survived longer, performed better. She never flew, never fired, yet her work changed battles. One evening, a senior engineer noticed unusual heat marks. He asked questions. She replied slowly, thoughtfully, "Engines are alive. You just have to listen." He dismissed it, but took her notes. Sketches, observations, behavior patterns. No formulas, just truth. Outside, bombs roared. Engines screamed. Pilots fought. And she quietly continued, guiding her machines, making the impossible possible, one tiny adjustment at a time. Image prompt cinematic WW2 German airfield dawn female mechanic working on fighter aircraft engine focused expression oily hands realistic lighting historical atmosphere. The next morning she returned before the sun had fully risen, the frost glinting on the runway, her breath visible in the cold air. She checked the engines one by one, listening to each hum, each vibration, as if the machines were whispering secrets only she could understand. One fighter stood out, its engine shivering faintly, unevenly. It had returned from a long sortie the night before, and the pilot had said nothing, just gripped the controls and survived. She crouched beside it, hand on the casing, feeling the subtle thrum beneath her fingers. It was alive, she thought, alive in ways no manual could teach. She moved a small plate inside the airflow channel, no more than a fingertip shift, careful, deliberate, barely noticeable. She imagined the metal bending slightly under pressure, redirecting the heated air to where the engine needed it most. That evening she stayed longer than usual, watching shadows stretch across the hangar, listening to the slow ticking of the cooling engine. Each vibration, each whisper of heat told her more than numbers ever could. She noted patterns in her mind, sequences of stress and release, times when the engine faltered and moments when it surged. Days later, the pilot took the same aircraft into the sky again. During a steep climb, mid-combat, the engine shuddered violently and then, almost magically, steadied itself. The pilot barely understood what had happened, only that he could continue, climb higher, maneuver faster. She smiled quietly to herself, knowing it was her intervention, a subtle trick no one else would notice. Over weeks, she repeated the adjustments on other engines, each time watching, listening, recording in memory. Her changes were invisible, her secret weapon unnoticed by anyone but the machines themselves. She understood that survival wasn't about power alone, it was about timing, about listening, about knowing when to let the engine fight for you. Occasionally, a fellow mechanic glanced at her suspiciously. But none dared question the girl who could coax life out of machines that others declared broken. She worked at night, she worked silently, her notes scattered in sketches, her observations coded in patterns only she could read. Bombers droned overhead, distant explosions vibrating the hangar floor, but she focused on the delicate heartbeat of the engine before her. Each adjustment, each careful tweak, made the difference between a plane returning and a plane lost. And she knew, deep down, that her hands were the reason some pilots lived to see another mission. Image prompt cinematic WW2 German airfield morning female mechanic kneeling beside fighter aircraft engine carefully adjusting baffles and plates focused expression realistic lighting historical accuracy. The war was growing louder with each passing week, bombs shaking the ground even when she worked in the hangar, but she remained focused. That morning she examined a Messerschmitt Bf 109 that had returned with engine covers scorched and oil leaks running thin streams across its panels. She could tell at a glance that the engine had been pushed beyond normal limits. It hummed unevenly, quivering like it was exhausted, begging for attention. She knelt, fingers tracing lines along the cylinder heads, feeling heat patterns, listening to the rhythm of pistons moving under stress. She remembered her father's words, "Machines have a pulse, and if you listen, they will speak." Adjusting small airflow channels and realigning tiny internal baffles, she worked slowly, almost meditatively, ensuring that each change could withstand the next battle. It was painstaking, careful work, because one misstep could mean engine failure or a destroyed aircraft. She imagined herself inside the plane with the pilot, feeling the strain of each climb, each dive, every sharp turn. Hours passed and she finally stepped back, wiping sweat from her brow. Days later, the pilot reported that during a dogfight over the forested hills the engine had behaved unnaturally well. Mid-turn, the aircraft maintained power, climbing faster than expected, allowing the pilot to evade enemy fire that should have hit him. She smiled faintly, knowing it was the subtle adjustments she had made. The trick was not power but patience, timing, subtle redirection of airflow, minor corrections invisible to the untrained eye, yet enough to stabilize an engine pushed to the edge. She began keeping a mental map of all her modifications, each plane's reaction, noting patterns in vibration, temperature spikes, and throttle response. At night she would trace lines of airflow in her mind, adjusting angles that could only be imagined, until she could hear the engine's needs before even touching it. Her hands became extensions of the machines themselves, coaxing life where factory engineering assumed limits, and in a war where seconds determined survival, her silent work saved lives. Even senior engineers began to notice a difference, though no one could pinpoint why these engines lasted longer, responded better, or recovered after extreme stress. Only she knew, and she continued her work in quiet focus, shaping impossible resilience from metal, oil, and intuition. Image prompt cinematic WW2 German hangar afternoon female mechanic kneeling beside damaged fighter aircraft engine tracing airflow and adjusting baffles focused expression oil-stained hands realistic lighting historical atmosphere. The early morning fog hung low over the airfield as she approached her section, the smell of oil and fuel mingling with the cold, damp air. Her eyes immediately went to the Focke-Wulf 190 that had returned from a grueling sortie the night before, its engine shuddering softly, a subtle tremor beneath the cowling that spoke volumes to her trained fingers. She crouched, her hands moving over the metal, checking each cylinder, each valve spring, listening for anomalies in the rhythm that might indicate stress or wear. She noticed a pattern that others would have ignored, a small imbalance in airflow caused by the heat expansion of a particular cylinder block under combat stress. Without hesitation, she slid a thin, curved plate she had fashioned from spare sheet metal into the internal channel, angling it just so, imperceptible to casual inspection but precise enough to redirect airflow where the engine needed it most. She could almost feel the engine breathing in response, a micro-adjustment that would activate only when temperatures spiked during maneuvers. Hours passed as she repeated the process across other aircraft, taking mental notes of variations in engine response, vibration, and timing. By mid-afternoon, a pilot approached, skeptical at first, asking why his aircraft felt smoother during a previous climb. She only smiled faintly, responding, "I listened to them. That's all." Later, during a surprise interception over a dense forested area, one of her modified engines began to overheat as expected under the extreme climb, but then stabilized mid-ascent, giving the pilot enough control to outmaneuver enemy fighters that should have easily caught him. Reports of such occurrences began to circulate, though no one could explain why. Her modifications were too subtle, too precise, invisible without understanding, yet undeniably effective. Night fell, and while the airfield grew silent, she lingered, reviewing every adjustment in her mind, imagining the airflow. She wove life back into engines that should have failed, turning near-impossible survival into reality. Image prompt cinematic WW2 German airfield morning fog female mechanic kneeling beside Focke-Wulf 190 engine adjusting internal baffles hands covered in oil focused expression realistic lighting historical atmosphere. The sun was setting, painting the hangar in streaks of gold and orange, and she stood back for a moment, wiping her hands on a rag, oil-stained and trembling slightly from hours of careful work. The engines around her hummed softly, some cooling after sorties, others awaiting the next mission, each one alive in its own way, responsive and resilient thanks to the adjustments she had made over months of trial, observation, and quiet intuition. She thought about the pilots, flying high above the forests and mountains, trusting their lives to machines that should have failed under stress but didn't, engines that sang instead of braking, thanks to subtle redirections of airflow, tiny baffle adjustments, and the precise timing of components only she could orchestrate. Memories of the first damaged aircraft she had worked on flashed in her mind, the trembling pistons, the uneven rhythms, the heat lines that spoke like a language only she could read, and she felt a quiet pride, knowing that no manual had taught her what she had done, that no engineer's formula could capture the responsiveness she had coaxed from metal and fire. Outside, the distant echoes of war continued, bombs thudding somewhere far away, the hum of surviving planes fading into the horizon, and yet inside the hangar, there was silence, a calm achieved by knowledge, care, and intuition. Her notes, sketches, and mental maps were secret, encoded in patterns she alone understood, and though the war would eventually end, the lessons she had learned, the machines she had nurtured, and the tiny invisible interventions she had made would carry forward in ways she might never see. She glanced at a fighter returning from its last sortie, the engine stable, responsive, almost breathing as she had taught it, and she smiled softly, knowing that survival had come from listening, patience, and a touch of ingenuity. No one would ever write her name in history books, yet in the quiet pulse of every engine that held together. In the face of impossible odds, her work lived on. She straightened, glanced around the empty hangar, took a deep breath, and for the first time that evening, felt a sense of completion, knowing that in a world defined by war, she had made the impossible possible, one engine at a time. Image prompt cinematic WW2 German airfield sunset female mechanic standing beside fighter aircraft engines wiping hands and observing adjustments oil-stained hands reflective expression warm golden lighting realistic historical atmosphere.